On this, the April 7th, 2024 edition of What's Going On with Shipping, we look at ship scrapping coming to a near halt. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. Before we get into the main feature, I want to do a quick little update of what's happening in and around the port of Baltimore because there was a lot going on this weekend. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Biggest news came out on Friday when the Unified Command announced that dive teams had located the third of the lost workers, Maynor Yasser Sazo Sandoval, 38 years old. This is going to happen during the process of recovery and salvage of the bridge, where unfortunately the missing workers, there were four, now we're down to three, will eventually be recovered. And much as we saw during the recovery operations at places like the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in 2001, work will come to a stop as they recover the remains of those who were lost. In the other process here, we did see some other work. One of the things that I think we need to take a moment and talk about here is the damage done to the motor vessel Dali. Dali has suffered severe damage to the bow, so this imagery here is probably one of the best I've seen on this. There is a physical gouge taken out on the starboard bow. You can see where the name is cut in half, and that entire front section of the ship has been removed. Basically, it was eaten away, just chewed away by the collapse of the bridge onto the bow. You can see part of the concrete pillars on the bow, and then about 3,000 to 4,000 tons of roadway and steel trestles all across the bow of the vessel, damaging the forward containers. The ship's bow is down. You can notice that it's waterline. You can see a little bit of the red boot topping there, but the entire forward bow section is down. The ship is aground. We had information that there is a gas line underneath the bow of the vessel. Now, there is no damage to the gas line. However, what they don't want to do is drag the vessel out and dig a furrow in the dirt below and potentially scrape across the gas line and cause a breakage. So they're going to have to remove what is left of the bridge off the vessel, get the bow floated up. One of the things that they're doing to facilitate that is they are starting to offload containers from the ship. And we see that being done. Each container is going to have to be individually rigged to come off the vessel. Notice that there are containers that are damaged, which makes the stacks unstable. Some of the stacks have fallen over. Containers up on the bow of the ship are typically light or empties and also hazardous material. And the reason you put hazardous material up on the bow is very easy. You want it so you don't want it below decks, where if there is a spill or an issue or a fire, it could basically endanger the entire ship. You don't want it aft on the vessel because that's where your machinery spaces are, so you don't want to endanger that. You don't want it in the middle of the vessel where you'd have to fight fire from both sides. So you want it isolated up on the bow of the vessel. This is not unusual at all. And it's one of the reasons why you saw the yellow containment boom that was around the vessel. We're also seeing the beginning of the debris removal as pieces are cut. They're put into barges and they're going to be trucked over to Trade Point Atlantic, the old Sparrow Point facility, for eventual scrapping or shipping out. Remember, the biggest pieces you can move are going to be restricted by the size of the cranes that are on scene. And I think we forget the scale and mass that we're dealing with here. It is just enormous. So that even when you have cranes like the Chesapeake 1000 that can lift 1,000 tons, or the Weeks 533 that can lift 500 tons, you've got to cut pieces that meet that level. And we're seeing that. We're seeing sections of the trestle. This is the above water sections we're seeing right now being cut. But remember, that's the easy part to cut. That's the straightforward above water. It's when you start getting into the water with zero visibility, about a knot or two of current, that this becomes extremely difficult. And more cranes are arriving on scene. So we're definitely starting to see more assets come in. Right now, the schedule that has been posted by the Army Corps of Engineers is by the end of April to have a channel about 240 feet wide by 35 feet deep that ships can come through into Baltimore. Now, 35-foot draft, that's going to be basically car carriers or maybe very shallow draft container ships. But the big bulk carriers, especially the coal bulkers and the larger container ships, will not be able to come through that. And that is not going to be, envisioned to be done until the end of May. But if you look at the weather right now, they're going to have poor weather the end of this upcoming week. That's going to put a big hamper on operations in and around the port of Baltimore. All right, let's go ahead to our main feature today, talking about ship scrappings and the slowdown that has resulted. This is a story over in G Captain Mike Schuller. Ships recycling plunges to lowest level in decades. Ship recycling has plummeted to its lowest level. This is from a report from BIMCO. BIMCO is a large kind of trade group. It stands for the Baltic and International Maritime Council. And they put out great reports. Their news service is a really good one to look at. But what they're basically saying is that in the first quarter of 2024, just 2 million deadweight tons of ship capacity has been scrapped. This is the 9th quarter in a row where it's below 3 million tons. But over the last 2 years, only 0.1% of the fleet has been recycled. That is in comparison with 0.45 over the last 20 years. So if you look at the chart they provided in this, you can see recycling in blue and how it kind of matches up with share of the fleet. So you can see the amount of tonnage. Tonnage being scrapped was very slow until 2008 when the huge economic crisis hit. Then everybody found themselves with excess tonnage and you had this massive scrapping that was taking place. Then in 2015, we saw a whole batch of new ships coming online. This is because of the investment in vessels and a little bit of an uptick in trade. And so you saw investment. We saw new type vessels coming in, especially in container ships, much larger in size. But since 2020, we've seen that decrease. Why? Because there is a need for more and more ship capacity. We envisioned that there was going to be a mass scrapping here once the new container ships came online, but because of the Red Sea now and the diversion around Africa, more container ships are being used. And so container liners are chartering vessels like Maersk chartering the Dali, for example, to fill these gaps in their schedules. So this is a great graphic put out by UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and they have 4 criteria here that they're looking at commercial shipping. They have the top 10 here, but I added 2 other countries into the mix, and I'll explain why in a minute. And so they look at 4 different categories. We're, of course, looking at recycling. We're going to look at that here last. But if you look at building, for example, countries that build vessels more than any else are there in the dark blue, and you'll see them there. It's going to be China, it's going to be Korea, it's going to be Japan. Those countries are really the largest shipbuilders we see. China has about 44% of the world's shipbuilding capacity. Korea is just under 30%, and Japan is just under 20%. So that's really where we're seeing the vast bulk. About 94% of the world's ships are built in East Asia, so right here in those 3 countries. Now, there's more shipbuilding around the world: Italy, Finland, Colombia, Philippines, Vietnam, but all those countries are less than 1%. It doesn't even account for any large appreciable number. When we look at ownership is really confined into a couple of key states here. Greece is one of the largest owners of vessels, China, then Japan, then Korea, and then the United States. The United States sits in 11th place when it comes to ownership of vessels. When it comes to registration, what flag do you fly on a vessel? Well, there's 3 that make up over 50%. That's Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. And then you have, of course, China in there, Greece, Japan, a few other countries. But those 3 countries, Panama, Marshall Islands, Liberia, make up over 50%. And so the open registries have become the norm. So what's really interesting is if you look at ships are built in East Asia here, across China, Japan, and Korea, but where they go to die is into South Asia. There are basically 3 countries in South Asia, 1 in southwestern Asia where we see that happening. So Bangladesh is number 1, India is number 2, Pakistan is number 3, and then Turkey in number 4. And because of the reduction in the number of ship scrappings happen, we are not seeing vessels heading there. And so the ship scrapping industry, or more importantly, the recycling industry, because ships are designed to be recycled now, taken apart, and then elements and components reused, is not taking place, which means the world's fleet is starting to get older. So this data comes from the UNCTAD's review of maritime transport 2023. It shows you the age of the world's merchant fleet by vessel type and registration and their deadweight tons. So if you look in the far right column, this is the average age for 2023, and it breaks it up into different types of vessels: bulk carriers, container ships, general cargo, oil tankers, and others. But if you look at all ships, the average age for ships in 2023 right now is basically 22.2 years. That's up from 21.7 years. And if you look at how it's broken down, 10.7% of all ships are less than 4 years old, 14.3 are between 5 and 9 years, 20.8 are between 10 to 14 years, 12.4 are between 15 and 19, and 41.8 of the world ships are more than 20 years old. Interesting enough, those ships, 41.8%, their average size is around 6,470 deadweight tons. The largest group is actually the newest vessels, because what we're doing is we're building a lot more newer, larger ships, so that when you look at percentage of deadweight tons, the number of ships over 20 years old is only 12.5%, whereas the youngest fleet is 19.4, 5 to 9 is 22.1, and then the percent of in the 10 to 14 category is 30.7. So the world's fleets are getting older. And what this means is we're using ships longer because of the issues associated with COVID. Because of the diversions now being initiated by the Houthi, ships that typically would have been sent to recycling are not being sent to recycling. So container ships that should be going away, because new container ships are rolling off the assembly lines in China, Korea, and Japan, they are being pressed into service because they got to go the longer route around Africa. Tankers, which should have been scrapped a long time ago, are being kept in service first because of what happened in the Baltic and the Black Sea because of Russia invading Ukraine and the emergence of the Dark Fleet, with over 400 to 700 vessels involved in the trade of Russian oil. Ships that normally would have been recycled are now being used for that. And now that oil and refined products have to go much longer distance, what's called ton miles, those ships are not being scrapped. So we're seeing older and older vessels out there on the high seas. So it's 2024. You should be seeing vessels that were built right at the beginning of the 2000s getting ready to be recycled, and anything built in the 20th century really should be looking that way. Modern ships today are not designed to last long, even though we will see ships out there for 40, 50, or 60 years. Most modern ships are not designed that way. They have very low tolerances in their hulls. They're not designed for really prolonged stress. And most importantly, systems change out, especially in propulsion. And so one of the things we're seeing in the commercial service is you want to phase out ships. You don't want them to last too long, because the fear is your propulsion system may become overcome by events because of IMO regulations. And now all of a sudden you have a ship with a plant that is not able to operate because it's emitting too much carbon dioxide or sulfur or some other gas. And so what everybody's looking at is creating these ships that are really short term. Problem is 2024, IMO 2050 is the goal everybody's shooting for. This is going to be the 50% reduction. And if you build a ship today, or start building a ship today, it'll come out in a few years, 2 to 3 years, that we've seen the extension out on how long it takes to build a ship. Well, guess what? You are right up against that edge of the window. So container ships are coming out now. We're starting to see some tankers being built because of the uptick in the tanker market, particularly in the clean market, diesel, gasoline, aviation fuel. However, what we are worried about is that ship construction is slowing down. It's taking longer to build a ship. It's getting more expensive to build a ship. And we've seen consolidation in the shipyards. From 2009 to the present, we've seen a 40% reduction in the world shipyards around the world. And we've seen those yards that are out there consolidate into ever bigger yards. China, for example, took a whole series of small little yards and started consolidating them into larger and larger groups. CSSC, the Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation, now builds by itself 20% of the world ships. And it gives you an idea of that. So the recycle yards in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Turkey are pretty empty right now. The only ships you're really seeing sent there was early in COVID, some cruise ships where the cruise lines were getting rid of excess capacity, and now some just really old and obsolete vessels that just can't be efficiently run anymore. But once we get stabilization in the shipping industry, whenever that friggin' happens, I have no idea based on the past 3 years. Whenever stabilization happens, we'll start seeing vessels scrap. So, for example, if the Red Sea magically opens and the Houthi go away, then you can expect to see a lot of container ships heading that way. If the tanker companies start making a lot of money because of the movement of cargo along with bulk carriers, then we can expect to see those start going away as new vessels are being built in the yards in Korea, Japan, and China. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Until our next episode, this is Sal signing off.